the American people cannot agree to the net neutrality rules that the activists want.
Yeah.
There is a major fundraising lobby which fundraises off this issue. And they are also aligned with net neutrality activists around the world who push this issue. So they actually don't ever want it to be defined in Congress because then they can't fundraise off of it. They are hoping that it stays open-ended because it's a long-term business plan for them.
Yeah, and as long as it's an unresolved problem, there's money associated
Correct.
with it. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We actually managed to make it into the studio today because the train drivers, the train people about whom Ian was so kind last week. You said they're all wankers.
Did I?
Yeah.
I must have been in a bad mood at the time.
Yeah, that was quite funny.
I conjunctivitis, so I blame that.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
He'd never say that.
Well, so you misread it. You'd written down bankers and you just misread it. Anyway, so they're being nicer this week, and the trains ran totally on time, I'm pleased to say.
Right.
So we're back in the studio, and before we go any further, we should say we're also delighted to have our first special guest of the year, who's Rosalind Layton, who is part of Strand Consult, and among your core areas of expertise are net neutrality. And in fact, you're over here because Ofcom's asking for experts on a consultation about net neutrality, which I won't jump the gun. You can tell us all about that. But we're delighted to have you. Welcome. Thanks a lot.
It's so great to be here.
So yeah, that's that. So needless to say, we're going to talk about net neutrality. There's an adjacent topic, which we also wrote about on Telecoms.com this week, which is sometimes characterised as the fair contribution debate, which is should people like Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, who generate most of the data traffic, chip into the cost of the infrastructure that runs it.
Yeah, well, their users generate it. But
well, there we are. As you can tell already that there are some strong opinions. Easy, Tiger.
He's like a loaded
There
spring.
are some strong opinions on the matter, and they're all wankers as well. He's just going to turn into some kind of Sex Pistols sort of pundit.
You and Gary Oldman.
Yeah. And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll see. I mean, there's all sorts of, we've already been chatting for almost an hour before this and going off on all kinds of tangents, so that could cover it all. But there might be one or two news bits to do with infrastructure. I thought it was interesting that the CEO of Cellnex stepped down this week, apparently bored of the prospect of not buying a new company every week. So maybe we'll get onto that. We'll see how time tells. What else to say? So we've had dry January, but this is my first beer of the year.
Dry mid-January.
And I think I appreciate it all the more for not having drunk for 2 weeks.
so do I. I mean, when you haven't had a beer for a while, you feel like going through it really quickly, don't you? And
Do you know what I found?
I don't see this one lasting very long, actually,
It's
before
not
another
gonna
one
touch
makes
the
its
sides.
way to the table.
Well, we've got 6 more in here, and we've got some more in the fridge. So you go for it, mate. Don't hold back. Whether Rosalind will be happy in an hour or two's time that I've said that is another matter. Rosalind's just having some water, but we can allow that.
We'll allow it.
But her colleague John Strand, we had plenty of Danish beer with when we were over in Copenhagen. And apparently he's got a bit of FOMO, John, about Rosalind being on before him. So sorry, John. I mean, we did try and make it happen late last year, and you're always welcome, mate. But, if you snooze, you lose, son. Simple as that.
That's what I say.
Yeah. So there we go. What else? Sort of quite a nice day today. Quite sunny, but brisk.
Oh my God, so much wind.
better than it has
Yeah,
been.
it's windy. Pierre came in and his hands were all cold from being on his
Was cycling against the
special
wind.
bike.
Not as bad as last night, though.
No,
Yeah, it was really
Woken
windy
up by the
last
wind
night.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what else? Nothing much else to report other than it's been a sober start, and I'm quite happy to be back on the beers.
Jeff
Yeah,
Beck died.
Jeff
Sorry.
Beck died.
Oh, he
Yeah,
did,
that was sad.
yeah. Actually, a few people have died. A few celebrities have died so far this year. But
quite often happens at the start of the year, isn't it?
I think you get the Christmas celebrations out of the way, and then you're like, well, done it.
And you
now,
can imagine when it's like musicians that die, you think they don't have a regular Christmas, do they?
Wait, who else
No,
died?
they
first?
really go for it.
Yeah, they're like.
Lisa Marie Presley.
Yes.
Oh,
that was
yeah,
one- that was
yeah,
one
today,
today.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she's not a celeb in her own right, really.
She was only like 51.
Yeah,
54, I think. Yeah, I know. I'm not far off that. Now I'm on the wrong side of 50, people start dying that aren't that much older than me. That fucking does my head in. What was it, Viali? How old was Viali?
That's
but
the
that's
other one.
pancreatic cancer.
Cancer
So.
related.
Yeah, but still.
Yeah, 54, I think. Yeah, as well.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Well, I think you need to compare it with all the aging rockers who are pushing 90.
Do you know what I mean?
You know, I mean,
Stone's still touring.
Yeah, the Clint
Keith Richard.
Eastwoods of the world, and
Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
91 and so on, who
Yeah,
are
that's
just
amazing. And still making films at
Yes.
91 as
But-
well.
but-
It's quite
But Clint, I don't
astonishing.
picture Clint Eastwood doing all the drugs when he was young.
No, but I
Keith
think they live
Richards.
clean. I think
Yeah.
that they,
Yeah.
like Sophia Loren is 90 something,
Yeah.
and she looks incredible. So she's
Clint Eastwood just sort of did women, didn't he? Rather than booze and drugs. His thing was women.
Was it?
Yeah, it was. He had he's got dozens of kids from different.
Oh,
Yeah.
so he got around.
The girl who was in
True.
a few of his films, I can't remember her name now. Every Which Way But Loose.
Sandra Locke.
Sandra Locke had 2 abortions that were his.
Right.
His kids, and yeah,
Okay.
he was living with her while he was married, living in another house
So-
with her while
well,
he was
I tell you
married,
what.
and-
I
yeah.
tell you what. Have you seen photos of Clint Eastwood back in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
50s?
he's a good-looking guy. I know.
That's
Yeah.
the closest to gay I ever get, man. that bloke's so fucking beautiful. If him and Paul Newman were in the room,
Yeah,
I'd have to just say to my wife, "Sorry, love, you've had a good innings." those are some bloody good-looking men.
No, Paul Newman, yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
Clint Eastwood and Paul Newman.
Annoyingly.
Just irritatingly so. Right, okay, that's that then. Yeah, well, we'll just crack on. Just to remind you, if you're watching this on the site or on Facebook, on YouTube, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. I always forget.
That's when you do your sensible voice bit, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm practicing
like
for
someone
when
reading
our salespeople actually flog some ads on the pod.
It's like
And I've
someone
got to
reading the
do-
small print, on a pharmaceuticals drug.
Yeah, you do it
It's
really
like
quickly.
It's like, only because...
Yeah, warning, this may make your head blow up, but there's a very small chance of that. Yeah, exactly. Right, so net neutrality. Why don't I just pass the ball straight to you, Rosalind, just to talk about the hook, which is what you didn't just fly over from Copenhagen to be on this podcast.
No, I would,
Though
and
you
John
would,
wouldn't.
and John
See,
can't be bothered.
That's so, but
What were you over here for as well as this?
Yesterday, and I think it is of interest to your listeners and readers and watchers and so on. And I salute Ofcom because they are the first European regulator to say, look, we've had net neutrality rules since 2015, 2016. What's the evidence? What's the efficacy for the policy? And
Just proper review.
Yes, if you read the European Parliament rules, UK subsequently made its own. It specifically states that net neutrality should promote end user rights, and it should guarantee the engine of internet innovation. And then there's a series of provisions. My role in this is, I earned my PhD studying net neutrality rules across 53 countries.
So you've actually got a PhD in net neutrality?
Yes, I do.
Damn.
I earned in Aalborg University.
I will push back with caution.
No, but this is part of I think what's missing from the discussion, that there is actually thousands of academic articles measuring, studying the policy, which never enter the discussion. Regulators don't review. And those of
I heard some stat that something like only 10% of all academic publications ever get cited, and all that.
it might
sort
be
of
less
thing.
than that.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's
but there's some good stuff there that just gets
absolutely,
lost.
and because at least before I worked in academia, I was in marketing, so I have some sense about you need to bring your research out of
Yeah,
the
you
dusty
can't just leave it
library.
sitting there.
You need to communicate it, and that is part of our.
Perhaps you can help me flog my book, which I've singularly failed to do so far.
So
Well, that's good that they've invited you then, because it sounds like they're
Well, they
doing
had
things
a
bit
number of
differently
people
than-
across the board.
Yeah.
They had, 15, 20 different persons who were trying
I
to
saw
bring.
various of them tweeting yesterday that they were there. And,
so they had, of course, your usual.
Did I see Dean Bubley tweet?
Yeah, he was there.
Yeah, so the usual big tech, big telco, but they've also had regulators. They had USA, FCC, they had the Dutch regulator, they had former German regulator. So different perspectives. I was the one academic. I think there are some people who do have academic background, but I try to bring a quantitative methodology that would measure what's the impact of the policy, which in my mind is, if you're a good regulator, the way we teach it at Aalborg University, it's classical regulation. There's a market failure, you apply a policy, fix the market failure, you remove the regulation, and the market goes on. I mean, if something's hindering competition, address it, and then you go forward.
It's just a good methodical,
Yeah.
and also not losing sight of what the point of regulation is supposed to be. Because I think sometimes, I talk about this all the time on the pod, to the point of cliche where Pierre always smirks when I bring it up. But I'm a sort of laissez-faire, light touch, small government kind of guy. But Adam Smith, way back in the 1700s, who's considered like the granddad of all this stuff, was very clear about cartels and monopolies and how that needs to be dealt with. And so, in other words, whether he used the word regulation or not, he was basically saying there has to be some state market intervention to actually make sure markets function properly. Otherwise, it's the nature of people to form monopolies and thus abuse them. So not lose sight of what the purpose of regulation is. I think sometimes regulation itself can sort of grow and metastasize and become regulation for its own sake. And so what you seem to be trying to do is just say, look, let's not forget what we're trying to achieve here.
Because if you accept the premise, if it's supposed to work the way that the proponents say, then you might change a lot of your assumptions about innovation and marketplaces and policy and so on. So let me just summarize what I found in my research, and then we'll get back to what Ofcom was saying. But basically, I had a hypothesis that if we assume net neutrality rules create the engine of innovation that the European law says it does, then we should be able to see countries with hard net neutrality rules will have more locally made innovation than countries with no rules or soft rules. That's my hypothesis.
Yeah. And just sorry to butt in. I was going to bring this up before. When you said the purpose of net neutrality, can you repeat again what the stated purpose?
Well,
of
in
net
the
neutrality
European law,
in Europe,
because again,
obviously in the States,
and
just
the
so
law
people
doesn't
should
even
know,
say net
even though
neutrality.
you come from Denmark, your accent obviously reveals that you've lived much of your
I'm
life
from
in
USA.
the States.
Yes, I'm American-born from Pittsburgh. I grew up in Florida.
So you know all about that side of things. But in
that's
Europe,
a whole other.
Oh, didn't your football team just lose? No.
Steelers?
No, the Steelers are still in. So the Packers.
Yeah.
Different.
My Steeler Nation. I'm sure there's one in London. You
Dol-
say football, I'm thinking, what?
I'm a Dolphins man myself.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Anyway.
just so you know, in the European law, there is the word net neutrality is not there.
Doesn't exist.
There's no definition. There's no
Right.
legal statutory definition of what it is.
So how can you make law without that?
They say
so
open
what do
internet
they-
access. They say blah blah blah.
Okay,
regulation.
so there's the sort of
This
woolly concept.
woolly all
And
over.
how do they define open internet access?
So
What you just said earlier. Yeah?
right. So basically, the policy goal is supposed to be to protect end user rights and to promote the internet as an engine of innovation. Okay, those are extremely hard things to
and
yet alone measure.
And this is what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
The latter one, that's already starting to get into sort of going against what I think the purpose of regulation is. When they start seeking certain benign outcomes from regulation, that's different from preventing malign outcomes.
Correct.
So preventing monopolies, we all know why monopolies are bad, because no competition, no incentive to produce, to service the market well. Okay, that's a malign outcome. But then when they flip it and start saying, and it would also be nice if there were more pretty daisies in the parks as a result of our regulation, then they're
Well,
veering
Rosalind's
from their
rule of
core
regulation: if it sounds good, it's bad.
thing. Right.
It's kind of my.
Because part of it's sales. You used to work in marketing.
Yeah.
You know, the more people are going, like you see how legislation, what is it? We had a hilarious one in the States recently. They called it the Inflation Reduction Act. And it was actually a massive bunch of state spending, which of course will increase inflation. But the Americans, and I don't mean this a bad way, I'm a big fan of America, but Americans are the kings or queens of marketing. And often for me, marketing means, if not outright lying, then at least embellishment or lying by omission. And, you know, and that applies to your golden rule about regulation. The more they say this is fluffy bunny, everyone will make everyone happier regulation, the more you got to go, hold on a minute.
That you should be skeptical. But then that's, the point that I try to say is if in fact you accept the premise, all we need to do is make this rule and it's sweetness and light and everything will be great, then that would change our education policy. It would change our markets policy. In any case, I thought it should be simple, that we should be able to see, as a result of the rules, 7 years hence or whatever, the countries with those hard rules, meaning no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, no price differentiation, all of the bad no-no-nos, that we should have more innovation. That's their premise. Again, under-theorized in the literature, but that is the premise of how it is. Now, what I found is that there is no added benefit to have hard regulation. Soft rules are sufficient, and countries with no rules also have good outcomes. So to just put it into perspective very quickly, if you compare Denmark and Holland over a 5-year period, Denmark started in 2012, 2011 with self-regulation, where the operators wanted to get ahead of the regulators and said, we can provide even better outcomes than the regulators. In Holland, they made the toughest rules in Europe, where they said, no price discrimination, no differentiation, no blocking, as hard as they could do it. And now, what I found when I measured those two countries in 2012 and again in 2017, Denmark had 1/3 more apps made locally, and the top Danish app produced more revenue and had a higher rank than the top 20 Dutch apps. And I just mean locally made apps, not companies. I mean, meaning an internet app born digital to do a unique thing on that app. So a video game like Subway Surfers. So the interesting thing is, you'd said, well, what does it have to do with net neutrality besides nothing? But the point is, the Denmark telecom industry, that model of that market, had more freedom to price in such a way to get people to try 4G. They could get them to try a smartphone. They had free data offers, all the things that were illegal in the Netherlands. They were still doing 3G and prepaid. Denmark succeeded to move its population to the next generation network faster. So that meant that the app developers in Denmark had a better test bed, more critical mass.
Right.
So I don't get the definition. The blocking and throttling is quite clear.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of someone stopping a service from running on your network, and I think that we were talking about this before we came on. That goes back to the days when they sort of tried to block VoIP services and.
Right.
And throttling's a similar thing, I guess. But to me, those things wouldn't happen anyway in a competitive
You could use competitive...
market. Unless you have a telecom monopoly, I don't see that anybody would do that.
Yeah.
The price discrimination, I don't really understand, because, I mean, we're going to get onto this fair contribution thing, but at the moment, the application providers don't pay, or occasionally they might, but they don't generally pay for traffic. The end users do. And... you know, I can buy a faster service and pay a bit more money for it, or, that happens at home. On my BT account, they're often on about me upgrading and paying £10 more a month to get sort of whatever it is, 76 megabits a second rather than what I'm on, 40 or whatever. Isn't that, I mean, that sounds like if you read that rule about price discrimination, that's the kind of thing that you shouldn't be able to do, and yet that seems to happen all throughout Europe.
Well, so I think there's one thing about, again, there's different policy actors here. I think that there has been certain policy actors who wanted to push the envelope with this law because they've had an ideological goal or a corporate goal or whatever case may be, and they use net neutrality as an empty vessel. So where we are today, where the European Union, the European Court of Justice has said there's literally no commercial differentiation allowed on a broadband subscription. It has to be uniformly priced, no zero rating, regardless of the fact that 1 billion people have come on the internet for the first time because of free data offers. Been most beneficial for the poorest people. And we also did free data for all the Ukrainians who've come into European Union. All telecom operators have offered them.
So strictly speaking, that could, if you interpret net neutrality in a certain way, that could be deemed to be illegal.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And that's where we are now in the European Union, that it has become so religious. And again, the word zero rating is not in the law either. But these interpretations, which defy what the text even says, because it's such that there are certain people who can argue that at the courts or within BEREC, body of European regulators for electronic communications, and then they will accept that interpretation and put it in their guidelines. So if any people here who are concerned about big government or aggressive lawmaking or litigation, rulemaking, this should concern you because, it's sort of pushed the envelope of what it was meant to do. It was all sort of done, this is fine, it's going to be easy. But now we're coming to the place where we can't, even in the case of pandemic in UK, it was illegal to give free data for school kids to learn from home.
It's bullshit, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and Ofcom had to. Now, fortunately, Ofcom recognized that, and they're proposing to liberalize that so that it's be allowed. And, God bless them for it. It's wonderful. But that is the kind of world that we're in, that are more caught up in the purity of upholding this principle, which nobody can define, versus are we legitimately helping people with broadband?
Well, I know there's been a couple of cases in Europe as well. It might be the Netherlands or Germany where tie-ups between Deutsche Telekom, for instance, and these might not be the companies, but the companies of this nature, Deutsche Telekom and Spotify,
right,
where you, like you say, you zero rate it so someone can use that.
Well, I would love to use that example, Ian, if I could, because the top European app today is Spotify at position 50 in the world's top 243. How did Spotify get a foothold?
What, apps by downloads or subscribers?
No, because they did a partnership with Europe's telecom companies so that you could buy Spotify on your mobile bill.
Sorry, I was just wondering how you rank these top 50.
Sorry, it's by market value.
Okay, sorry.
Marks, I beg your pardon.
Sorry.
So, and that's the other part of my research that I presented. But basically, what Spotify would do was work with KPN in Netherlands or Deutsche Telekom so that you didn't have to go to Spotify on your mobile phone. You just bought the premium subscription on your mobile phone.
Yep.
Okay, and that was great for them because they got money in the door. They could invest in their systems, and so of course people use the free ad-supported version. Spotify did that for years and grew. And now we don't have that. No other European startup can ever use that model again because it's deemed as illegal, because it's differentiated. And somehow or other...
But it's the sort of... That's where I really have an issue with this, and I'm on your side, because I feel that if you interpret it that rigorously, you're almost saying any kind of tie-up or partnership between an operator and an apps company is out of bounds, because as soon as they have some kind of, even if it's a marketing thing together and you're not zero rating, you could say, well, you're giving that company an unfair advantage over somebody who doesn't have that relationship.
And it doesn't mean, you don't, the customer, there's so many partnerships out there that don't move the needle. How many? There's a graveyard of failed partnerships, right? That I'm sure you've written about and so on. But I would say
one of my favourites is still Ericsson and Cisco. Anyway, sorry.
No. But so the one other point that I brought up was that from the whole Europe perspective and UK perspective, before the rules were put in place, there were a number of UK and EU companies who were in the top 20 of world's largest internet companies. They're all gone today, or they have fallen down the list. And that concerns me because the policies that we're adopting to promote innovation are not legitimately helping European enterprises. The largest players are bigger than ever, have more market share, more revenue. European players have not succeeded to get a foothold, and maybe those entrepreneurs move to the U.S. or Korea or wherever the case may be. But so if you look at the record, if the policy was supposed to make us more innovative, it hasn't worked.
Yeah.
And that's my concern.
And, and to summarise what I think your point is, do a bit of active listening. Their stated aim is that one of the two reasons for them fucking with the market, I'm very much paraphrasing you here, is to promote innovation. And you're going, all right then, even though that's a bullshit pretext for regulation anyway, and you're going, all right then, has it? And you're going, here's some data that you've done a fair bit of exhaustive research on that says it hasn't. What have you got to say about that?
They might not present it as innovation. I know that's probably the subtext, isn't it? They want to prevent, because one of the arguments I know that gets attached to net neutrality, and I'm not saying I go along with it, but is that if you have this sort of paid prioritization stuff and allowing partnerships of that nature to go ahead, then it's the big companies that will do well. It's the Googles, it's the Amazons that are in a position to have those kinds of relationships. Yeah, I can see that, because
you're sort of incentivizing weight of spending power.
And clearly it doesn't sound like it's worked out this way.
It's helped the big companies to the detriment of the small ones. I mean, we have blocked off the ways the small ones would have otherwise.
But they were thinking about it the other way around, weren't they?
And so, but to them, they thought of it that way. Now, if you're a game theorist or a heterodox thinker, you'll immediately say, this is going to hurt the small people. And we have a lot of game theory studies that show that the small companies that would have emerged have not.
And bureaucracy on the whole, I mean, I'm getting very purist here, but bureaucracy on the whole tends to harm smaller companies more, if only because bigger companies like Informa can have whole departments for compliance and the law and all that shit.
But do you find that they need to be convinced of that? Because there's obviously lots of reasons why I think the big internet companies in the US have become so powerful over the last few years. And you could say one reason is that regulators were asleep at the wheel when they allowed Zuckerberg to buy Instagram, for instance, and the sort of network effects of search engines. But I'm just thinking, if you're trying to convince a regulator on this innovation front, do you find people just sort of throwing it back and going, well, that's not really the reason, actually, that we have
They
that kind of
don't really have
dominance?
an answer. So first of all, they don't have an answer. And I also present the methodology to them. They can measure themselves. I would love them to do their own measurements. But I think there's two things to keep in mind. One is if you look at the fintech, the world of unicorns, which is something else. I have a new report out from Strand Consult, and I present all this in a palatable form. You can read it's 40 pages looking at all this. But I look at unicorns, right? UK has lots of unicorns, fintech, but no internet unicorns, no internet innovation unicorns.
And can you just define unicorn?
Unicorns being an enterprise of 1 billion, market value of 1 billion that is privately owned.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a startup in inverted commas,
yes.
but a big one.
So lots of those in the financial domain. Again, we talked about some crypto is lost its way, but nevertheless,
just a bit.
Start and grow in other not net neutrality covered domains are actually going on in the UK. That's interesting. And then the second point here is if you actually study net neutrality, it's been a policy promoted by the large American tech companies so that they could purposely avoid the transit fees, the interconnection fees, reduce them, price squeezes, and so on.
Oh.
And that would be my
That's
other...
where it overlaps with our second
That's what
theme,
would take us
isn't it?
to the other theme. Now, I'm not dismissing that there are definitely people who care about, is your content blocked, this, that, and the other. Today in the BBC, it's okay. I hope okay to mention it. There's a youngster here, Tommy Innit, who's a YouTuber, and he goes onto YouTube and he's like a Mr. Beast of UK, right? And he's saying, "Oh, but
have you heard of Mr. Beast?"
Yeah, my son knows and watches.
So
just checking.
Yeah.
So my sons too. They're crazy with this Mr.
I only
Beast.
heard of him when he went on Rogan, actually, even though he's huge.
Anyway, so he says, "Oh, but you know what? YouTube could change things tomorrow, and my traffic would be gone." So. Somehow we had this conception that the telecom operator was going to strangle the innovation in the cradle. But now you have these content creators who are saying, oh, how do I succeed on YouTube? How do I succeed on this, that, and the other platform? So it's not correct that the only area of concern is the telecom company, right? There's platforms are gatekeepers, app stores are gatekeepers, Twitter is a gatekeeper, whatever, the regulator's a gatekeeper. To simply say we're going to isolate how innovation works and it's only the telecom operator, anybody who has any sense and who's critically thinking would say, wait a second, there's something wrong with that problem formulation.
Yeah. I mean, I don't like the idea of sort of extreme rules in any area really, and or on either side of the equation, if you like. And I just find that net neutrality is. I know one of the concerns actually from talking to operators in the UK, because they brought this up at a press conference a year ago, maybe a bit more than that. But Vodafone UK was talking about now I know there's different opinions on network slicing. How successful it's going to be, whether it's another sort of something that might not go anywhere, but it's certainly something that operators want to experiment with. And their sort of chief network officer for the UK, Andrea Donner, was saying one of the big issues with network slicing, one of our concerns about it, is that there's just not enough regulatory clarity around net neutrality. And I know this has come up several times actually from people I've spoken with and at conferences, that if you have this really hard and rigorous interpretation of net neutrality, then this idea of providing, of kind of slicing up the network and doing prioritised services for certain types of company might be not allowed. And I know that the EU's tried to have this specialised services kind of fudge, I call it, really, because they don't really like the idea of we might be clamping down on some kind of innovation that comes out of 5G. Let's do a fudge and call those specialised services, but. But obviously that hadn't kind of made Andrea Donner any more sort of easy about this. He was still pretty nervous. And he said, so he would obviously welcome this kind of Ofcom review and hope that it leads to something that's more specific and more sort of permissive, I guess, on that front.
Well, I think was quite telling in that session. In the second panel, we had, BBC was there, you had Akamai, Netflix, and they were discussing how over the pandemic, the internet worked. Yeah. Actually, everything was fine. And, people got the content. In fact, the loads went up. The interesting that happened was because there was not sporting events, there were not these huge peaks. So once they could kind of get a hold of it, things kind of leveled off and they could manage. But the point that I raised for that panel was that, fair enough, you made it through, but you're not at bringing 5G to enterprise. So, for example, in the United States today, you have several thousand small and medium-sized enterprises using 5G-enabled AI in the with robots and so on.
Yeah.
It's not going on in UK to the same extent. It may be in
because of this network slicing sort of
network slicing, but also just because you haven't rolled out 5G networks to the same degree. What I point out is no leading 5G nation has hard net neutrality rules. If you look at U.S., China, South Korea, Japan, they either have no rules or soft rules. And it's quite significant that this notion of 5G and a smart network is incompatible with net neutrality being a dumb pipe.
Yeah.
Right? Don't go together.
When people on the other side say, well, the reason they've rolled out 5G quickly in those countries is it's other things. It's, China, it's very sort of government directed, and the US is, you look at the margins that the operators make in the US, and it's much healthier. They make a lot more than
US,
European
remember,
ones,
took
less
rules away.
Basically.
It's quite significant.
Well, they take them away and put them back again, don't they, whenever someone comes, someone new comes into the White House.
But we've had now 7 years without rules.
Yeah.
So there's been a long run-up time, and actually things got...
pie period.
Right. There's been a long period in U.S., and you've significantly closed the digital divide. You also see in the data the cord cutting, because the fixed wireless access is coming in. People are, going all wireless in their household. They don't have a, fiber to the home connection. They just go with a fast wireless. South Korea and Japan, I think, are probably the best we can learn from, because they were never going to do this. They said, fair enough, we respect this idea. We're going to protect end users. We don't need to have these special rules. We'll have some guidelines. Every 10 years we'll look at it, because they want to have the world's fastest networks. And if you take South Korea, you've got 5G adoption at 47%, it's the world's highest, and you have 86% fiber to the home. They have the highest adoption of the networks. And of course, so they respect that you need to have the investment.
I just want to take a quick step back. Rosalind, at the start, you were pointing out that there's nothing in European law that talks about net neutrality. We've just touched on how in the States, again, this is always going to, whenever I say this, it sounds like I'm slagging off Yanks, but I'm not. I just know more about, it's the second country I know most about other than the UK, because of the amount of podcasts I listen to and all that sort of thing. And because
you get a lot of slices of life from the podcast.
Yeah, well, I hope I get a decent range of them.
Exciting. It's actually a wonderful. There's so many subcultures.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm perhaps over reliant on things like Joe Rogan, but I don't think that's bad. Anyway, and also the States, they speak English. They're a massive sort of cultural, political, economic interest to the whole rest of the world. So it's reasonably.
We have a British tradition.
And we got a special relationship, supposedly. But what was I going to say? Yeah, and so it's ill-defined in Europe, but we're, for some reason, still trying to base law around something that has no fucking definition, which seems completely bonkers to me. In the States, it's, as with so many things in the States, this is me covering my ass for generalising about America, as with so many things in the States, it seems there's almost nothing that can't be turned into a sort of political tribal thing. And as far as I can tell, net neutrality in the States, you've got, for want of a better term, leftist Democrats who consider it to be quite an almost a sacred thing. And presumably there are, as you'd often expect of people who perceive themselves as leftists, there'd be a sort of philanthropic public interest angle to all that.
It's very simple. It's about the money. It's about which companies align with party.
Right.
So you have the
in practice. I was steel manning the position. In practice, of course, I think no less cynical than you, or I think realistic rather than cynical. But that's how they'll position it, and then the rightists and the Republicans will tend to philosophically be more laissez-faire. Let's let the market decide. But then it all gets hysterical and people freak out, and
you have bomb threats in the regulator. Ajit Pai had 24-hour security. His wife and children were harassed at their home.
But this is why the whole debate is so silly in the US. This whole, and I don't think people really understand it properly, do they? These free internet people.
Well, that's what I wanted to lead up to. I was being very meandering about it, but I thought, why don't we, given that it's badly defined in Europe, and it's defined in a polarised way in the States. Why don't we, in this room, starting with Rosalind, who's forgotten more about this than I'll ever know, how would you define net neutrality?
I call it internet regulation, and that will trigger people, okay? Because there are telecom
because the internet's supposed to be totally free.
No, but there are actual real telecom regulatory policies. I mean, we teach them at my university. We teach universal service, which, of course, it began as something different, but there's a specific statutory meaning of universal service.
Right.
There's a statutory mening of interconnection or statutory. So there's no.
What does universal service mean?
Meaning, in the United States context, it has to do with the provision of the broadband networks in what's called high-cost areas. Could be a rural area.
Yeah.
Or
it's like BT's universal service obligation.
Right.
You know, that they have to provide coverage to everybody.
Absolutely everybody.
For telephones.
Even some rando living in the
For
Shetlands.
telephones.
For telephones.
Right, I see.
So this is the discussion there with broadband is...
Should that be applied to that?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. So, but at any rate, to just bring on your point quickly on the political side, this is so pronounced in the United States. And any major company in the U.S., they have lobbying arms which go to the Republicans. They have lobbying arms that go to the Democrats. But the policy has been pushed by the Democrats. And whenever the FCC is one way or the other, you see that the policy will switch. But it hasn't changed because you had a Republican FCC, and now it's 2-2. Now, the other issue
Partly
is...
because they're struggling to find their fifth commissioner,
Yes,
isn't it?
but the other issue
Why
is...
is that taking them so long? Don't worry about
on
it.
terms of Congress, the American people cannot agree to the net neutrality rules that the activists want.
Yeah.
There is a major fundraising lobby which fundraises off this issue. And they are also aligned with net neutrality activists around the world who push this issue. So they actually don't ever want it to be defined in Congress because then they can't fundraise off of it. They are hoping that it stays open-ended because it's a long-term business plan for them.
Yeah, and as long as it's an unresolved problem, there's money associated
Correct.
with it. What do the activists want? With the pro-net neutrality activists, what do they want? What's their utopia?
They want to have a government-owned... They want to have municipally owned government networks with a BBC on top. Their view is communications should be government owned. So the news should be government owned and
Hence
the network
it's a
should be
leftist
government owned.
thing.
I mean, that's like that's really taking it to another level, though, isn't it? That
I mean, you asked me what ideologically, that's the end game. If you look at the people who have thought, like Robert McChesney, who defined it. Now, I'm sure not every rank and file Democrat wants that.
But to go from this notion of we can't have blocking or throttling and don't stop Vonage from being available to we need a government owned. Now, I mean, I can see why it would lead there.
Yes.
And I think this is why it's such a silly thing because these people with their little banners and free the internet, the internet isn't free. It's owned by lots of companies that spend a huge amount of money on it every year, whether that's the operators or the kind of app companies, the big tech companies. You can have a debate about that, but the point is it's private sector stuff.
But if you think about that, how convenient it has been for America's big tech companies to align with the leftist movement that gives them cover for all of the money that they want to make and all their objectives. And then they can be seen as a kind of, they're serving each other.
I think that's very cynical, and this whole thing about, because when the issue first came along, late 90s, early 2000s, I think when people started talking about it a bit more, it was very much we need it to protect smaller innovators, smaller internet companies. That's often how it's pitched. We need to have net neutrality because otherwise, you Scott Biceno in his shed setting up his website and trying to compete against Google potentially will never get anywhere.
Right.
And yet, that's just rubbish, isn't it?
There's nothing stopping me doing that now except my own indolence and lack of inspiration.
No, but what I'm saying is that people who are sort of, the kind of free internet people would say if you don't have net neutrality rules and protections, that job is going to be a lot harder for you.
Yeah, but then it's incumbent on them to prove it.
Yeah.
It's incumbent on them to prove, and I would argue. So this is where this stuff does get quite ideological. And as I've said countlessly, endlessly, I think it's important for everyone to acknowledge their own biases and pre-announce them. Not because biases are bad, but because everyone fucking has them. And if they're out in the open, then everyone knows what they're dealing with, and you can move from there on. And my bias is towards laissez-faire, it's towards low regulation, small government, letting things run their course. And I've realised that it's actually just... I think people are often like this. It's just part of their personality. This is why it's so futile, people having ideological fallings out.
Yeah.
Because, if you happened to be a real card-carrying leftist and I'm this sort of laissez-faire, I think the government should just shut the fuck up most of the time, we will disagree over nearly everything. But that's not because one of us is right or wrong. It's just because we're hardwired differently. Anyway, and this explains why you will get, generally in general elections, you tend to get a 50-50 split. People seem to fall into that. But this is where it's ideological, because, you know, what Rosalind was talking about, some of her evidence that she presented earlier about how if you have lower regulation, more innovation happens. Well, that is completely consistent with my ideological presuppositions, that it's only by letting the free market run that you get innovation, that you get the proper profit motive. That, you know, if you and I wanted to go off and start up a business, the reason we'd do it is because we'd hope that we'd eventually end up making more money than we're making now.
Yeah.
So that's all that. And then the ideological, and then I'll shut up. The ideological counterpoint to that is people who basically distrust the free market. They distrust individual incentives such as profit. And they think, in my view, mistakenly, that if the government's in charge, then somehow that will all be dealt with and it'll be evened out and everything will be fair. I'm not going to get into my views on what I think the government's really like, because then I'm going to go off on the fucking deep end. But that's where I can see this gets really ideological.
So I like to, go through that and say I'm okay with allowing the free enterprise, but where we can demonstrate that a regulatory policy will succeed and deliver the promised benefit, I'm okay with it. I believe there's a role of regulation.
But then demonstrate.
Yeah, and then I would say what's really happened here, this unintended consequence or the perversion, is we have things where broadband subscriptions, which could legitimately help the poor, people in cost of living crisis and so on, are outright outlawed.
Yeah.
And that to me is the opposite of the whole point about we were supposed to have better internet. And so what about the end user rights for children to learn during the pandemic when you're locked in your home, right? And you can't get, 1 in 5, it turns out 1 in 5 kids don't have a computer at home. There's only one smartphone. And they really needed to make sure they could enable that program. So
what about if you get away from these sort of ideological positions to the sort of nitty-gritty of it a little bit more, and the blocking and the throttling stuff, and I think it's the blocking. I think is a bit silly.
So there's an example I'd love to give you that came up yesterday. I think it was so telling. It was Meta was describing how it's amazing to me that Meta was saying to Ofcom that they wanted the regulation needed to continue so Meta could innovate, because they're making this metaverse and we want to have best efforts internet. And by the way, we're going to make the world's biggest data world ever known, and we want it to run on best efforts internet. And you have to make sure that nobody else is going to have a specialized service that gets in our way. Yeah,
because that's the argument, though, isn't it?
Bollocks to me.
But this, I mean, we had William Webb, I think you probably know. We had him on the pod a few weeks or a few months ago. Actually putting this argument forwards that he one of his issues with network slicing, and that it's not going to go anywhere, and it was very much from a sort of regulatory perspective, was that if you do, I mean, there's obviously a finite amount of capacity on a network, If he likened it to a supermarket where you have a fast lane for a bunch of customers who are prepared to pay a bit more, and then everybody else has to make do with the other lanes. And he was saying, well, obviously, if you do that, then the other lanes are, you're going to have problems. There's going to be a sort of capacity issue.
Yeah, and there'll be an incentive for the supermarket to populate the fast lane with staff more, because that's where there's more.
So how do they? This is the concern: is that if you do carve out these specialised services, for companies that are, very high, very whizzy, and they're paying a bit more, then the best efforts, I don't really like the word best efforts, but the best effort stuff becomes somehow degraded.
Right.
And that would be a justification for having some kind of net neutrality rules.
Well,
is
you
that
have the postal
warranted
system.
at all? Or?
No, I mean, so I ordered something to the hotel and it's not going to come till tomorrow. I would have liked to pay more to get it today.
Because you're going to be back in Copenhagen.
Yes, right. Yeah. So there's a case where I, as a consumer, is missing out because, I should have bought the fast delivery. I assumed that if I had 5 days, it was enough or what have you. But
you'd like to think,
I know. But
it's going to arrive on the back of a donkey.
Do we argue that regular postal mail is so bad and we have to get DHL for every package? No. But we have, and even in the case of Netflix, when they were DVD by mail company, consumers have always been able to buy a fast lane.
Yeah, even in the normal postage example, in the UK, we have first class, second class.
Yes.
No one's ever got a problem with that.
Well, I do, because second class is rubbish. It's appalling. And
then don't do it.
The supermarket. Yeah, but this is the argument about if you have these, like I say, these fast lanes at Tesco's, and you put a lot of resources into ensuring those fast lanes work properly, but you've still got the same amount of resources overall, then your normal lanes
yours is a defined size of cake argument. But that doesn't necessarily apply.
Why doesn't the defined size of cake argument apply? Because capacity is not infinite.
Capacity is not infinite, but you're talking about resource. You're talking about manpower. You're talking about OPEX, aren't you?
I am in the Tesco's analogy, but the point is, if you put resources into a fast lane, then you're taking them away from somewhere else.
So now we're imagining the cake being a dissection, a diameter of a pipe, and the more that goes into the fast lane, necessarily the less. I'm not saying you put
lots of people to run things along the pipe.
I'm adjusting my own critique, but you're basically saying that there's a.
If you've got a finite amount of resources and you have a specialised service or a faster service for some people, then you're taking those resources away from another part of the pipe.
So the thing is, you can actually go into supermarkets and you can notice where they have the self-service line. Now, is the self-service line a fast lane? Now they have also fast lane if you're only using a credit card versus cash.
Yeah.
They actually, if anything, what I would say is businesses try to serve their customers in many ways. Right? Is it discriminatory? Now, do we experience... Now, so I would say, look, as the companies are going through some change, have you gone into are you at that point where do you go places now and they're still having human beings check you out when you go to the drugstore or whatnot? It seems so slow. You'd rather go to the machine, right? But they haven't upgraded every supermarket or what have you. Or do you feel now that everything is digital and you have to use the digital screen and there's no employees working? There is a state of flux, and in general, it's about that business and the capital. What do they want to invest? Do they look at individuals versus so forth? From the Ofcom panel, the assessment was, on one level, there's already fast lanes because Netflix can take its server and put it inside the network. And hardware is allowed. You put your server inside someone's network. Now, this was the chap, James Barford, from Ender's Analysis. I thought he made a very good point where he said what's the difference of offering that as a software service? Why is it okay to put the server in the network, but you can't offer a software fast lane? He said that makes no sense.
Yeah.
Because who wants the software fast lane would be the startup who doesn't have the relationship with the ISP to get their cash over there. They could just buy it and say, please serve my content in the same beautiful quality as Netflix, and I'm willing to pay for it.
Would they be able to afford it, though, I suppose?
No, but I mean, it's one. But listen, the cost is not. Versus what? Then do they need to go to every network in the world and buy?
And here's why I don't quite understand this network slicing stuff anyway. Because this idea that you run fast services for some companies and other people suffer. Going back to my BT thing earlier about buying a faster connection speed, isn't that the same thing? If I can go and buy a 76 megabit per second pipe,
which I can,
as opposed to my 40 megabit per second one at the moment.
Or 1 gig.
But I think different apps need different things. If you're doing a software update, does it have to be going at the megabits at the gigabit speed? No, it can go overnight. It can be at a downtime. If it's an SMS, it doesn't need that. But there are some things, if they don't get priority, they won't work. It's sort of like a person in a wheelchair. You can say, well, everyone has to take the stairs. It's best efforts. You can't get up the stairs if you're in a wheelchair. You need an elevator. So you're going to need the fast lane. There are certain kind of services, let's say a video game or a remote surgery, a kind of a telemetry that has to have a fast lane, guaranteed SLA in order to work.
So that's the network slicing thing.
So I don't know I don't think network slicing has to do with that. I agree that it would, in my mind, network slicing becomes very hard to deliver because
in a circumstance of strict net neutrality.
Because I think 5G is against net neutrality. In my mind, when I think of it as from a technological perspective, a smart network and a dumb pipe are not the same things.
Yeah.
Well,
Andrea Donner's comments about there needs to be more clarity and.
Totally.
And not just him saying that, it comes up at European conferences all the time, it seems. And I know there are lots of network slicing rather naysayers, and I'm kind of sceptical that it's really what companies want anyway. I think it's likely they might just build their own private networks actually to get those kinds of services. But I think it's just odd that they seem to have, the European Commission seems to have run ahead with its sort of enthusiasm for net neutrality and then gone, oh, hang on a minute.
It was their
specialised
workaround.
services.
Right.
But,
So
but the whole thing just seems to...
But there's so little that came up as well. There's so few examples. But for me, I think the answer is if you look at the rollout and adoption, so few Europeans are even adopting 5G because you can't do the offers, because of the regulatory uncertainty, because there's not the demand, all those things.
Yeah.
And then you go to a country like South Korea where half the people have adopted 5G. It's in every company, and there's no question of this. So to me, it does matter that it's unclear because your lawyers in your company say, do not deploy. You will not get the approval.
Yeah.
We've been chatting for nearly an hour on this, so I'm going to try and sort of wrap it up and sort of summarise where we've got so far. I think even now, I mean, Rosalind, you define net neutrality as internet regulation, which is a good but I think very broad definition. If I was to define net neutrality, it would be along the lines of transparency for me. It would be, by all means, chop and change the service that you provide, but make it clear that you're doing so. And as you say, Ian, I can choose to pay BT more for a 1 gig fibre to the home service versus 50 meg bog standard service. No one's got a problem with that. How does that not get in the way of net neutrality? So it's so sticky. You can get
the thing about those things is it's not even as though they guarantee that as a minimum service level, is it? I mean, there are times when everybody gets on the watching the World Cup final, and you're streaming rather than watching it on terrestrial, which we sort of do. We've got ourselves into doing that for some reason. I don't know why, but and then your quality goes down. You get the fuzzy picture.
I tried to watch some of the World Cup on ITVX. It was a nightmare.
Yeah, Netflix actually does degrade the quality when they have sort of bandwidth issues, and it doesn't happen very often. But it does happen when you get like lots of a sporting event that you're conscious all your neighbours are watching, and maybe some of them are doing the same thing, and all of a sudden so they can't guarantee that you're always getting 76 megabits per second or 40 megabits per second.
That's the best efforts for you.
So best efforts is just in itself. It's just.
But that it
doesn't mean anything, does it? Really,
I think the solution to it lies there as well as the transparency that I would like to see. Is if when you sell someone something, you sell them an internet service, there are certain regulatory obligations as to the minimum service that you've got to deliver. So let's say, I don't know, there's an asterisk. I mean, I don't know what
they are, and they're not very well communicated.
No, this is hypothetical.
Oh, okay.
This is my utopia. This is how I'd like it to be. Yeah, no, in practice, it's all very woolly.
Small print in my
you know
BT
how
deal.
every now and then the advertising standards people. One thing that really winds me up is that with internet service providers, their advertising, they always talk about up to. I hate marketing terms that are woolly. Up to. So, because up to.
It could be 0.5
Exactly. It could be anything from 0 to that.
Yeah.
It's fucking bullshit. And every now and then the Advertising Standards Authority steps in and goes, no, less of that. But it doesn't seem to have that much power. But if there was a hard regulatory obligation, which let's say you were selling a 1 gig connection, and then Ofcom went, all right, you can sell that, and you can even put up to in if you must. But I'm saying that the starting point from your up to is at 500 megabits per second. The lowest you can ever go is half of what you're promising. This is arbitrary. This is me just picking numbers out of the air. So I think that's it. If they really wanted to protect consumers, and let's go back to your initial European Union definition. One half is protecting consumers, the other is promoting innovation. I think the latter thing, the promoting innovation, as I think you touched on illustrating, is a bullshit proposition and one they haven't delivered on. But protecting consumers, I think we can all agree, is supposed to be the primary function of regulation. There's just some really simple rules that they could lay down on that. So by all means, have all kinds of varying services, but this is where it's built into the transparency. You've got to say that we'll deliver this, and in clear, bold. And that means that the very least you'll ever get is this.
But you actually had that in 2015 in UK. You were better off in 2015 because you had a broadband stakeholder group with key facts indicators where there were performance metrics to perform like you're saying, where you would focus on the end user outcome or end user experience. Manage to that you would have you could even do independent surveys of what the operators are doing. But that is the approach Ofcom first took.
Right.
And they were kicked out of the park by European Union. So
Nah,
they wanted
don't get
to
me
do
started
it.
on that.
They wanted to do it.
Oh dear.
So, but
Is that why we're having this chat now?
No.
Because we're not in the EU anymore.
well, in the
The
sense
thing
that
you came to the UK for, apart from us.
No. In the sense that Ofcom is not beholden to maintain everything that European
Yeah.
Union does on this. So they are looking to say, can we get some benefit out of, we don't have to maintain the European standard. Can
Yes.
we do better?
That's the question.
Yes, and that's what they're contemplating.
I think one thing they can certainly do, I mean, whichever way they go, they can surely have more clarity on this than, you know.
Yeah,
I mean, whatever they come up with, I hope that they just make. And that was actually the thing. I don't think I'm misquoting him. That that Andrea Donner at Vodafone was asking for was just more clarity on what they can and can't do, because this whole specialised
And I don't
services
think the regulators
function-
know.
No.
They actually don't know. So in that case, I'd say remove it all, work on ex post competition regulation where you have a defined competition standard. You have to show harm to the consumer,
Yeah.
right? You have to have something that is tangible. You can't just block things at the gate and say we're never going to do this or that or has to be sliced or whatever it is. Then work with that, because we've seen countries 3 times as large as UK and larger are operating under that without bad consumer outcomes.
Yeah.
One more thing before we move on from this, I want to argue the toss over, is one manifestation of net neutrality is zero rating. Now, I've always maintained in my writing and in chats, we've probably spoken about it on the pod, I've certainly chatted to Ian about it in the pub, because we're that sad, we don't talk about football or whatever.
You talk about the internet policy at the pub.
Not always, to be fair to us.
It's not a regular thing.
Yeah, we'll get on to proper
Hey,
bloke
I'll go.
stuff
That's
eventually.
great.
After a couple of beers, we'll get on to sport and birds.
Clint Eastwood.
But yeah,
Termination charges.
exactly. Sort of 10:30. And another thing about termination charges, where zero rating. So when I've written about this in the past, certainly. So zero rating, in the context I've written about it, is the concept of not charging at all for internet services, be they over mobile or fixed networks. And it's important to make that distinction, because fixed networks, no one expects fixed networks to be metered, do they? So the concept of zero rating is kind of redundant on fixed networks, because everything's fucking zero rated by definition. So zero rating only applies to metered stuff. So let's say it's mobile.
Even that's not really metered, it's just capped, isn't it?
But in
caps are
effect
so
it's
high.
metered, because
Yeah,
once your
but-
meter gets to that level, you're cut off unless you pay more. Anyway, stop being fucking pedantic.
No, but it's not like there's a, because that's, I think it's an important distinction, because they
So
did
you're
try
not
and sell.
paying
Well, you want to
for
check
every
your meter.
increment.
I'm 80% used up.
If it was all
I think. Is that what
metered,
you mean?
that would be
No, I
a
take your
way,
point. You're not
arguably,
paying per
of
increment.
operators
Yeah.
recouping their fees more.
Yeah.
Is
And
one
it
of
also
the, is one of
costs to
the-
meter. There are some fixed networks in the world that do use metering in Greenland, and not
Right.
to go
Yeah.
off the topic, it
Yeah.
does exist.
You're
but-
not
Okay,
getting in a
noted.
car and it goes up for every minute you're in that car.
Yeah, no,
and that's how they tried to sell 3G originally.
I'll take back my accusation of you being pedantic. It's a good point. But in this particular case, it amounts to the same thing, which is there is some cost implication to usage volume. Yeah, whether it's incremental as you do it, or whether it's hitting a threshold. And lumped into this net neutrality debate comes this zero rating. I think to remember a little while back, UK mobile providers zero rating Spotify or something. And that was their way of luring you into using 3 instead of Vodafone, because if you're really into Spotify, you can stream Joe Rogan as much as you want on 3, and it's not going to go against your bill. Now, people would argue that's not net neutrality, because you're treating that Spotify traffic differently from other traffic.
But that's the thing that we were talking about, that there's been court cases over in Europe on the grounds of net neutrality.
Yeah, and just to quickly finish my point, I don't think that is, because you're getting the same service, you're just paying differently for it. So I just want to make the distinction between service quality and what you pay for the service, that's all. But I'll throw that out there.
Well, that's the problem with the hazy definition of net neutrality.
Yeah.
I'm guessing Rosalind can agree. Is that the court cases that have been fought in Europe on net neutrality have been on exactly that issue. That's the thing they've been fought on.
Yeah, and I think it's a non-issue. What do you think, Rosalind?
Well, I agree, but
Okay.
that's...
Well, meaning, so here's what I'm saying. This is a perversion where you don't even have the term, you don't have net neutrality in the law and not zero rating. And what is it used to litigate? It's used to litigate the pricing of the data. And again, this is actually driven in some part by, some Google-funded academics who have a religious view that all data should be priced uniformly, and that's more fair. But there's a business angle to this because there are the large data companies don't want upstarts who would use free data as a way in the door. And what's the other side of free data is sponsored data. So let's say you are a competitor to Netflix. You are, let's say, a large media company and you want to start a streaming service. You could say, Scott and Ian, I am going to pay for your data on my new Yellowstone series. Let's say it's Paramount wants to do that. They want to get in, they want to go against it.
Which, by the way, Rosalind recommended before we started recording.
Yes, we're talking about Yellowstone. I've enjoyed it, which, the Shakespeare of America. Anyway, the notion there is that I'm going to subsidize you as my end user to try my service. Net neutrality people go crazy over that.
Yeah.
But the point is,
if you're pro-innovation,
it's pro-competition,
it's pro-startup,
and especially it's against the incumbents. It is the way that you compete with Netflix.
So of course, Googling's lobbying against it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that is, to me, that's where the perversion comes.
Yeah.
Because the idea, what are the terms you were rating came from, the European Economic Community in the 1950s, was the way to avoid tax on books and wheelchairs and things that you needed to get out in trade and commerce without making them unduly expensive. So they received the zero rate. They were not taxed.
Right.
So the point there is...
Yeah, and we still have that with VAT in the UK.
Correct. You have things of zero rate. So the point... I think for me, why I'm not a net neutrality advocate is because I think people value different data differently, and the prices should reflect as such. So I would love an internet which had free access to anything such as education, employment, healthcare, and then things that are discretionary like entertainment, video would be what you'd pay for in a flexible rate, or someone would sponsor, or we sponsor everything that's .gov.co.uk, things that are government related, that we'd have a total, some that's free, and then the flexible part would be what's subject to supply and demand.
That makes sense. And if people are going to make philanthropic arguments, which will typically, although not exclusively, be people more on the left side of the ideological spectrum, then those philanthropic arguments should be coherent, and they should be, all right, are they, I've often argued this, and I'm certainly not going on this tangent now because it's got fuck all to do with telecoms, but I've got a term that I use called client seekers to describe the kind of people who adopt causes.
Rent seekers or client seekers? Oh, cause seekers.
Client seekers.
Okay.
So no, rent seeking is quite a well-established sort of,
they're consultants who want clients.
Yeah, but in a sort of social politics way, they'll be like.
They're policy entrepreneurs.
Or adopting another group of people as unilaterally as clients. So let's say here I'm in a pure social sense, I'm a straight white English bloke. So I don't have any victim points in the Great Victim Olympics. But I could say I really, or a claim to really give a shit about this protected group, this oppressed group, whatever. And I may do, I may not. But I think you will get certain people who claim to represent that group. But then if you actually ask, have your activities resulted in that group benefiting? Have they resulted in that group being better off? Or has the main upshot of your activities been for you to get more attention and for you to get proxy power by unilaterally adopting them? That's something I observe quite a lot. And this is where your test is. By all means, have the self-image and the drive to be a philanthropic person who wants to make the world a better place. But if by your activities there's no evidence that you're making the world a better place, then fucking change course. Otherwise, you're just doing it to gratify yourself, is my view. Well,
and the other part, if it's so wanted, Telecom could make such a program, like make that offer. Why don't you market this is your net neutrality brand. I'm going to certify that that's a subscription, that's the best efforts. I'm not done. Sell that. And offer that. If you actually legitimately think that's something that consumers want, then offer that. But you don't.
Quite.
Yeah. Instead of saying everyone has to do it this way, right? And we're going to prioritize this set of users over everybody else.
Yeah. So I think we can agree to draw a line on that one and move it on. If you've got a stated set of desired outcomes, then you should be judged by whether or not you've achieved them over a given period of time. And it sounds like that some of the evidence that you were giving yesterday called that into question. Of course, that may be inconvenient and they'll probably just fucking ignore it. But hopefully not. who knows? At least they called you in.
Well, and anybody can participate in terms to the end of today, which is the 13th of January. And they have had this for over almost a year and a half. So they have been quite open about it. I applaud Ofcom that they have been so open and inclusive to make it available for anybody to participate. In fact, I was amazed how few people participated given how long it's been available.
Yeah, well, but that's a weird thing in itself. I'm not going to go on a tangent, but this participation in democracy, like we have local elections. I'll bitch and moan about the bins not being collected, but I never bother voting in fucking local elections. I can barely bring myself to vote in national elections.
It won't make bin collections any better.
Well, quite, but this is one of the problems. If you've got proper process being followed, i.e. a public consultation, then it does rely, and maybe this is something I'll try and do more as a journalist. Not that anyone ever asked me to muck in, but maybe I need to do what maybe Rosalind did and put my hand up. If I had, maybe they would have brought me in and I could have gone to the House of Commons.
You can also,
or whatever.
I give this for any journalist out there, you can always take a PDF copy of your article, put a cover letter on it, and send it to the regulator.
Right.
For your information,
you
here's some background. Okay?
Yeah, I've been quite unkind about Ofcom over the years. I'll avoid those ones.
Yeah, but I would say, though, there is something to be said that the other part, the value of that session that they did, was they put people on different sides of an issue challenge each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
That's good. No, it's vital.
Yeah, that's important. And then because they need to hear for themselves and ask difficult questions. And where they are, they're also, our last panel was focusing on this cost recovery discussion. I know you want to get to that.
Yeah.
But I think that they have a very real concern is what is going to be, if it does come to pass, what's their responsibility and do they need to adjudicate it? And can they even adjudicate it? It should they be involved?
Which is obviously a fundamental question. It's one thing to argue about what an ideal outcome is, and then the second thing to argue is should the state be involved in trying to influence that coming about? Yeah, totally. And it all does get very ideological and very into core physics. It's not physics, civics.
Well, I mean, in some respects, you've had a price control regime under this, and what you sort of taught the marketplace is, you know what, you're going to price control our broadband, we're going to price control the other stuff. I mean, you've sort of fed the marketplace with that notion instead of saying, let's have the market actors work it out.
Yeah.
So I think it's only the other part is, we could also debate here, there's $7 trillion in the world's internet market ecosystem. Do we have enough connectivity or not? Do we have a shortfall? That, I think, is a great question. And there's that cash flow. Why does it not get to where it needs to be, or do we have too much connectivity? Right.
And that comes into other things which again slightly overlap with what we're about to move on to. But in the States especially, but to some extent in the UK and probably in the EU, there's an increasing call for governments and regulators to intervene in the activities of big tech more, which I don't know. I'm kind of 50-50 on. I can see arguments in both directions. But why don't we see if this next topic takes us there, which is what we call in our house style. It's not just us. We didn't coin the term, the fair contribution debate. One of the reasons I bring it up is, apart from the fact that Rosalind's here and she's an excellent person to argue the toss with about this, is my colleague Armita wrote a piece this week that we published called "A Look at the Pros and Cons of the Fair Contribution Debate," and it was sort of longish. It's longer than the typical news piece. I didn't count the words, but about sort of 2,000 or 3,000 words, I guess. And she just laid out the arguments for, and just so people know, a fair contribution debate. The debate is most of the traffic or a disproportionate chunk of the traffic that goes over telecoms networks is provided by the video streamers. So that is typically Google, primarily via YouTube, Netflix, obviously, Amazon via Amazon Prime, and anyone else, Disney, Apple, etc.
I don't know if Disney would be included in that batch.
Well, I'm just listing people. I'm just listing people who provide a lot of streaming video. Yeah. They're not necessarily including this batch, but just illustrating what a streaming video provider is. Certainly until Disney Plus existed, I wouldn't have put them in there. But as long as anyone's got an SVOD, subscription video on demand service, then I think they're part of this, if it's at all successful.
Well, we don't know if they're part of it or not.
No, I'm talking about me, not what everyone else says. Just me. I'm just saying examples of SVOD providers, that's all.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, in terms of the fair contribution debate,
yeah, no, I realise
because they're only
studies,
talking about
yeah.
5 companies.
Yeah.
I realise.
Yeah.
I stress again, the broader debate is just about SVOD providers. What you're saying is that you think that there are only 4 or 5 companies that typically get.
No, I don't. What I'm saying is Etno's saying, if you look at the
You're
way they want
passing
to
on
do
the message
this,
from Etno.
they just want to charge the top 5 companies, and anybody who falls below that threshold.
Well, cool. And then we'll get into Disney, because I think you made the point before we started recording, where is the cut-off?
Yeah.
So we'll get into that. But just to frame the whole thing before we get into the weeds, so they're saying that, so telcos, i.e. ISPs and MNOs, internet service providers and mobile network operators, are saying, look, we're building all this fucking infrastructure. They're sitting there saying this in a pub on a Friday night when they're talking to Netflix, who's also in the pub. They're going, look, Netflix, it's all very well you coming out with all this stuff, but we're the ones who've got to lug it over to everyone. We've got to pay for the towers, we've got to pay for the cable, we've got to pay for everything. What are you doing? You're doing nothing.
Yeah.
And then
Netflix is saying, we're spending all this money on content,
Yeah, what are you doing?
What are you doing on that side of things? And that's
hold
the
your
only
horses.
reason people use your networks
I'll stop
anyway.
banging on, because you've got lots of very good points to make in that direction. And I'm just explaining to people who perhaps aren't familiar with it what this is. So European operators are lobbying the European Union to ultimately, their ideal is for them to compel these US big tech companies to give them money, to contribute their fair contribution. I'm doing air quotes to those people listening. Fair contribution to the fact that all their shit that they produce is carried by these other people. And we just wrote a piece sort of summarising the pros and cons. Ian, I've stopped you a couple of times, so I'm going to stop stopping you. What some of your initial thoughts on that fair contribution debate and my intro?
I mean, it gets conflated a bit with net neutrality, because I guess when you start talking about fair, price discrimination, and the suggestion, I think, that's come up in net neutrality a few times, that internet companies should sort of, or could pay, or should they be allowed to pay for, I suppose this is the specialised services thing to some extent. If you come along and pay for a kind of guaranteed latency level or higher bandwidth, should that be allowed? And I mean, the problem with the way, I could see that Etno could get around that discriminatory thing, maybe, if they said, well, everybody pays, yeah? Everybody makes, based on what sort of consumption they're using, maybe we have a threshold that's your kind of hobby sites where they don't pay anything because they're not really generating anything at all. And then you have another tier.
But nearly everyone pays.
But everybody, because if you just cut it off at 5, then number 5 is going to go, well, why is number 6 not paying?
Why is
They're
Disney
still
not
generating
paying?
quite a lot.
Yeah.
And now I know Ros is going to make the point that the 5, it really is skewed heavily towards them. But I just think that framing it that way is a bit of a kind of challenge to them. I mean, I don't personally, one of my objections to all this, and one of the reasons I don't really like it, and maybe have a different position from Roslyn on this particular one, is I don't like this whole sort of victimhood kind of, we're hard done by, we spend all this money on networks, our costs are going up, we're not making
Which you could
any
argue
money.
they would have spent anyway.
I mean, we're not talking about railways here where all their drivers are on strike and they have a huge amount to spend on rolling stock every year that's Victorian age, and everybody's, and nothing works, and it's monopolistic, and you can't. There's no easy way to build another train track because you just can't do that. You can't have 2 running next to each other, and we're talking about companies that are very profitable. I mean, there's a debt situation in Europe for sure, but that's not to do with net neutrality or content.
No, that's just due to shit M&A.
That's a splurge, and that's spectrum fees and that sort of thing. And they're still very profitable organisations. It's not they're not growth companies, and therefore their investors make a fuss. And this happened today even. Vodafone.
Vodafone investors are moaning all the time, aren't they?
Vodafone's investors want it to be a higher growth company, and they're not happy enough about what it's doing. And
they presumably didn't do their due diligence before they invested in a telco.
And it's one of its responses today, it seems, if the FT is to be believed, is that hundreds more jobs are going to go as it tries to sort of improve margins.
We
and you get that
one.
regular sort of cost-cutting thing going on. And, I just have an issue with this sort of victim narrative. And I guess philosophically the other problem I have with it is this idea that this sort of who's responsible for generating. I mean, you framed it when you came in that the company's providing all this data.
What did I call it? I've forgotten what I called it. Something.
The company's responsible for all the
users
traffic.
generate the content.
You know,
so-
I mean, anything.
God, I can't believe it. I was talking about it 2 hours ago. It's gone out of my head. I'm getting old.
Well, before we came on the podcast, you
Provider
mean?
pays?
Provider
Something pays?
Sender
What?
pays.
Sender
I mean,
pays.
this
There we are.
idea that
God.
Amazon
God, I'm
or
losing it.
Disney, for instance, generates a lot of traffic is the other thing that I philosophically have a bit of an issue with, because, you know, Disney can make a show that nobody watches at all,
Yeah.
and it doesn't generate any traffic at all because it just sits there on a server and nobody kind of downloads it, nobody pushes the button to watch it. Those services generate a lot of traffic because the customers of the operators want to watch them on the networks that they subscribe
That have already given the operators
that they
some money.
spend money to the operators to be able to watch that stuff.
So if anything, it's a billing problem because it's unmetered.
Well, I just sort of feel it's like a business model problem the telcos have,
Yeah.
that they're looking at. Their sort of response is, well, you know,
They were trying to make it
we're
someone
not
else's
high growth
problem.
companies. If telcos were still in a situation like they were in the late 90s or the early 2000s, where there were still millions of customers to be signed up,
Yeah.
which is a position Netflix has been in until relatively recently,
and now it's plateaued.
and now it's plateaued.
And its share price has gone
if
down
they were still
accordingly.
in the situation that Netflix was in the last 3 years, I suspect we wouldn't be having this discussion. And I also think we wouldn't be having it if internet traffic volumes were the same as they are, but they were spread across hundreds of companies instead of
Right.
concentrated in the big five.
Okay, Rosalind, there's a lot to cover there.
You know
What's
what?
your take on this?
And I think you both made very good points. I want to take one step back and just talk about the textbook example of a two-sided market, and we'll use Informa as our example.
Okay.
Informa
Careful.
is a multimedia company.
wanna get
Is that
sacked.
correct? Okay. You have subscribers, you have events, you have sponsors, you have advertisers. Is that fair? Are there any other revenue
Yeah.
streams? Books.
Yeah, well, there's a whole other bit of Informa
I
that
tell
inform
you
with
what we
academic
do.
publishing. It's a massive
I
thing
know we
for,
do
for
events.
Informa.
What else do
Okay.
we do?
I also do.
We
I
do
can-
academic publishing. We do
Okay.
we do media.
Okay, it's very complicated. Let's use the Guardian magazine.
Yeah, there we
Let's
are.
use that Observer. The Observer
Pick
magazine.
one. We can't pick holes.
Yeah, the Observer magazine is the most popular magazine in UK. Made £225 million last year for two sources, from subscribers and advertisements.
Yeah.
Now, if we applied this net neutrality to the Observer magazine, you would say to Observer, great magazine, keep your subscribers, grow them, whatever, keep making, but we're going to cut off your source of advertising. You still need to put the advertising, you can't control it, but you're going to need to deliver your magazine without the revenue of the advertising, but you still have to have it. And so what would happen over time with that magazine? They would lay off workers, they'd reduce the coverage. So what has happened to the telco? There are two services happening with the telco in the middle. They're selling subscriptions, which is customer service management, account management, the network to their home, equipment, and some R&D. On the other side of the market, that's the B2C side. On the B2B side, they have to provision networks for the equipment, the electronics, they have the computing, security, the transfer, the transit, and so forth. Now, they're two different services, and they are two different markets. They're two different prices. So it is correct that they should work on both sides. And if you cut off the ability for them to earn revenue from the B2B side and say only the B2C side can pay, that's why you get people who can't afford it. You have to raise the price of broadband on everyone. Now, this notion that the users generate the content is true to only a certain point. I don't ask for advertisements. I don't ask for software updates. I can't control the way the content comes into the network, right? I have no idea the way the Netflix film is going to behave, because Netflix controls the definition, it controls the buffering, it controls all of that. And I can't control what it's doing to the other things in the network. So maybe I request the movie, but I'm not controlling the amount, the behavior of it. So the other part is, I'm not even a Netflix subscriber. Why do I have to pay for BT to provision the network for Netflix? Why don't you put a Netflix delivery fee?
But isn't the argument that you're
on
not paying for BT to provision the
But-
network?
but under-
You're paying for BT to provision the network full stop
Right.
for everyone.
I agree.
Which includes Netflix.
Right, but that is why I think that that's a bad model, because it makes it more expensive because of all the today we have constraints that we expect so as a whole set, the consumers have to pay 100% of the cost. In the rest of the internet economy, the providers of the service get to exploit different services to earn the revenue. If you go to Google search, You are going to pay with your personal data. You don't pay out of pocket. Google earns the advertising revenue, right? Telcos are not allowed to do that. Telcos cannot offer you a free broadband service and use your data to put an advertisement on it. So what I'm trying to say, the reason the whole cost recovery debate has come up is because we have constrained the ability of the broadband providers to earn the cost recovery on the other side, because net neutrality has unfortunately acted as a price squeeze.
So that's where these overlap quite
This is where
heavily.
they overlap. Now, there's nothing in the rules that say that you can't do it, because technically it's only about the end user and the last mile. But all the big tech companies say, oh, I'm not going to negotiate with you. It's what Netflix said in court in South Korea, because net neutrality rules protect me.
Yeah.
I can dump whatever I want on your doorstep. I don't care if it's uncoded or whatever. You have to pay for it. Now, I will give Netflix a lot of respect. They're very efficient. They do a lot to work with the big companies, but they don't work with the fiber to the home companies I've studied in USA in rural Oklahoma. They don't get the time of day from Netflix. Okay, so there is an issue when you are in a rural network with 10,000 subscribers. You can't charge more than $50 a month for broadband, but your users want to have Netflix. You're going to have to provision your network for that. You cannot recover the costs.
So is there a commercial exchange between Netflix and ISPs?
So,
well, they say there isn't, but there is.
There is. There's a lot. The large companies, they do make deals. Have you ever seen the Netflix button on the remote control?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that was transparent.
Yeah.
But is there, for example, a commercial deal that I might not be aware of between Netflix and BT, or between Netflix and AT&T?
I know it must be there, but it's not public.
They put their
Right.
CDNs close to, and there must be some kind of negotiation that goes on for that to. See, the problem I have is I'm not so much against the idea of a company paying an operator to get, because this gets into the specialised services area.
Right.
You know, because I think rules that stop things like that from happening, I agree it's like a barrier to innovation.
Yeah.
But I don't like the idea of it going right the other way, where the Europe comes along and goes, from now on, so-and-so pays. It's like that Netflix rule in Switzerland, isn't it? That they have to contribute to local content costs now. You know,
Which
like you must pay such a percentage of your
shamelessly
revenues.
political move.
I just find that really like.
So you've got to have more documentaries about cheese with holes in it and cooking.
No, I don't. You know the South Korea situation very well, and I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how that works. But the idea of every country sort of having rules that force internet companies to cough up and make a payment, just to me sounds like it. For a start, it sounds like it could backfire eventually, and I just don't like the idea of that kind of ultra. I think if they want to have these kinds of deals, I suppose the problem is, and I guess this is why this discussion's happened in a kind of regulatory setting, because if BT comes along and goes, we're going to start imposing charges on Netflix, then isn't there a possibility that Netflix just goes, well, we're not going to put our services on we're not going to run our stuff on your network then in that case, and then BT loses out and the other operators in the country do very well because they pick up Netflix customers. But isn't
that underpinning the whole thing? I mean, there's a lot of symbiosis
I can see what
that they can work together.
I can see why they've taken this to a regulatory level and gone, we need your help to be able to get this through. But then it becomes like a sort of cartel-like thing where they're all going, well, we're going to impose these charges, and then I know they're very, very rich, wealthy companies that have the ability to make payments and cough up, but there's a lot of networks around the planet. I mean, what are we talking about if every single government says you must contribute such and such to costs?
Well,
do we then get into a situation where the techcos go, well, the tech companies go, well, hang on a minute, maybe we need to start taking more of an interest in the last mile. You know, maybe we need to start building our own networks, and maybe that's not something that the operators really want.
So, but let's say Europe doesn't even have a baked proposal. This is quite evolved in the United States presently, the discussion at least. So let's put the other ideas on the table so you can at least know about that. So where the European Commission is, they haven't released yet the inquiry. There's going to be they're going to either make an inquiry or put something out there. We don't know. And I would agree with you. The notion of fair share is very whiny.
Didn't Berwick go, we're not interested,
right,
but then it's gone up to another level?
But
quite recently they've restated that opinion.
There was nothing even baked. They jumped the gun because there was what Etno has proposed is not even very tested. I mean, it's not even well formed, if you will. Okay, but let's look at I think there's 2 or 3 other models out there that have been proposed that's worth describing. The U.S. has a discussion presently under the universal service obligations that they would also need to be levied on the largest tech companies because there's cost to build out in rural areas, and they say it's not fair that this cost, as it's presently borne on the broadband subscription, cable providers don't even pay it, that they would make a set of companies that would have to pay this.
Well, now, and that makes sense. If you've got an obligation, then I can see how legally, in a legal and regulatory way, you just broaden the scope.
You broaden the contribution base. Yeah. And then the money, it doesn't go to the ISP. The money goes to the Universal Service Fund, and then the FCC distributes.
Right.
Okay. Now, I'm not advocating that method, but I just want you to know that that has a lot of traction in the United States today by the social justice community, as it turns out. So that's just
because they believe the FCC will distribute it in a benign way.
Yes.
Naive children that they are.
So let's put that in one box. That's one perspective. Now, you had a Nobel Prize economist, Paul Romer, said, why don't we make an ad tax, which would only go to like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, because the ad tax is not passed on to end users. The ad tax is borne by advertisers. Yep. So Google and Facebook account for a large share of the revenue earned on the internet. They are a place you can tax because there's a lot of revenue, and it's, again, doesn't get passed on to end users. I'm not advocating it. It's out there. Okay, it's better than putting a higher fee on the broadband user, right? So and again, then the money would go to the Treasury or some other government entity. Now, there's a third bucket, which I have advocated, called pay-as-you-go, where you'd bring some of the cloud services business models to the table, where you'd say, look, these are very preliminary. I mean, I've studied 50 companies, looked at what their traffic and costs were, and the traffic costs grow 3 times higher than the revenue. So could you look at something where you say, look, it costs me X to provision my network. For me to deliver into my network so many terabytes, it's going to cost me this. Now, assuming you'll do that, there will be some technological collaboration because already you could probably, if you're a Netflix, you can crunch down data all the time. You get more and more efficient. But the issue is you can't use the Netflix cache for Disney. Netflix cache is proprietary, right? So in some ways, you'd want a universal cache where you could put in everybody's, right? Presumably,
this is the US type thing.
But so then there's, and again, just because you put a cache in the network doesn't mean you lower the cost. You still have energy cost. People tend to watch more because it's closer to them and the quality is good. Now, but I would say is there some kind of non-government solution where the telco provider would say, I have to cover these costs the same way you would buy your cloud services on Amazon. So that's the market-based solution. Then you have the North Korean model, which is essentially
South Korea,
excuse me.
Fuck knows what the North Korean model is.
Now. I'm talking about the wrong country.
We've got one left.
The South Korean model says, look, it's a shared responsibility, and there's a declining scale. There is a certain amount of server capacity that has to be purchased, so they have graduated levels. And they have a cutoff there if your platform has 1 million users or is 1% of traffic, because they don't want to, if you're underneath that level, you don't.
That's your
now,
cutoff.
What happened with Twitch voluntarily reduced its resolution so it didn't hit the threshold.
Yeah.
Okay, so whether or not that's a good solution or you think...
Well, so I've got another one there. Yeah. I think law and regulation, ultimately it's about setting the rules of the game commercially. And just like in football, we've got the offside rule, just like in cricket, we've got the LBW rule. As long as that rule is applied to everyone equally, then that's fine. We all know where we stand. It's when law is vague. We were talking, I think, before we started recording about some laws that talk about fair or talk about the stuff in the UK. They talk about things like hate speech and they don't define it, but they still make it illegal, and all these sorts of little legal booby traps. As long as everyone knows the rules of the game, as long as everyone knows in football what the offside rule is, and if you're even 1 inch beyond the last defender, then the goal's going to get ruled out. No one can complain. They can complain about the interpretation.
More like 1 pixel these days.
1 pixel these days. Now that we've got VAR. But at least everyone still knows the rules. They can bitch about the rules, but they're the same rules that apply to everyone. And that's how I feel about law and regulation. And just one idea, just chucking it out here. I've had a few beers by this stage, so bear with me. Managing expectations.
It's a warning.
What if law/regulation said you can't have unmetered services? These are the rules of the game in this country. In the UK, you cannot offer, even on broadband, unmetered. It's got to be metered. And
they lose loads of customers.
Well, to who? Because it's the rules for everyone.
To the great outdoors.
Well, there we go. That wouldn't be a bad thing.
Everybody go canoeing
Everyone would
instead.
suddenly go hiking and shit. And they wouldn't know the footy scores when they're at the top of fucking Mount Snowdon. But, just think about it. It suddenly, just the rules of the game were it can't be metered. So everything's got to be metered. And now you could try all sorts of different things like, presumably that would incentivize companies like Netflix to offer a low resolution stream and all that kind of shit. Anyway, I don't know. I haven't really thought it through. I've had a few. I'm on my fourth beer. Mm-hmm. But that is just an example of other things that you can do to do with regulation that are simple. Some of the stuff you were talking about, Ros, was I obviously really had a lot of merit to it. And you're giving it a lot of thought, but it starts. The more you get into tinkering with this, that, and the other, it gets broken. How about just a simple thing?
I've got
you can't meter.
I've got a solution to your sort of pricing thing.
Yeah,
because I think one of the problems is, the metering is not going to work because they tried that initially and people weren't enthusiastic. I think it'd be quite hard to have those systems introduced. That'd be a cost in itself. For companies that make themselves out to be not doing that great at the moment, they have rising energy costs, staff are on strike complaining about higher wages, so you would introduce these metered systems and then everybody's sitting at home doing what they're doing with their gas bills, basically, like let's turn the heating down for half the day, let's not watch Netflix in the evening, that would be the direct consequence of it. But one of the reasons that European operators don't do very well is also to do with regulation, and it's the approach to consolidation. It's you look at the US where
we know Strand Consult has strong views on this.
One thing I was doing today, because I was looking at the little FT story about employee cuts. And I've got that spreadsheet, as you know, that shows revenues per employee, which is kind of a useful kind of productivity measure if you look at companies sort of roughly in the same sector. And you look at what the US operators make, and it's like 4 times as much.
And you look at the average bill in the States, they're paying so much more than we are.
Exactly. They're paying, because it's just a less competitive market. They have more pricing freedom. You don't have this situation where you've got this crappy little network in the UK called 3 with 10% of the market or whatever, but having to spend...
If any of you object to that characterisation, come on the pod and tell them why it's full of shit.
They're not maybe got a good example, but they were in the past with their rubbishy market share.
They're the fourth network,
you have
certainly.
these existing. The fourth network has really bad market share usually, and they still have the same build-out costs because they want to build a nationwide network. They still have the same kind of cost. They don't have the same cost base as BT because they don't have a fixed line network and they don't have the sort of legacy as much. But they have requirement to spend money on spectrum licenses. They have the requirement to put services everywhere if they want to be a national competitor, and then they pick up.
But then they're getting about a 10-15% share.
And it's like and I just think that's one area where I'm definitely more sympathetic to telco moaning about. Every time we get a bit of M&A opportunity coming along in Europe, and the European Commission comes along, or the regulator in the market taking its lead from the European Commission and goes,
we'll have less of that.
Or they go, you can do it, but then they go and sell a load of spectrum to Iliad and they show up and cut prices to $6 a month.
It's a race to the bottom.
And it's like, that to me is one of the problems that they've got.
Maybe it could be a positive. My hope is that this could be an opportunity to look at, and again, your article I think did a nice job to lay out some of the challenges for the industry at the start of the article. I would push back on the notion that the U.S. is not a competitive market for broadband, and given the cord cutting we've seen, that you also getting a higher next generation network. Personally, I think we pay too little for broadband. I think it's extremely valuable. it could be made easier for the poor with free services, sponsored data, things like that. That's where I think we would do more.
I think we pay too little in this country for mobile and.
If the Yanks pay too little, then we must pay way too little.
Yes, I mean,
we do pay way too little.
Look at the ARPU; it's like £20.
I'm a high spender because I think my mobile bill is like 60 a month because I've upgraded all the time
and you watch a lot of quite niche content.
But let me just give you an example from our study of Strength Consults coming out. When I looked at this, 50 fiber to the home networks, the typical, let's say, basic broadband package is $50. 2/3 of the subscribers will buy streaming that's $25. So clearly there's money that's in there, and that more and more, of course, the streamers want more money to go to them, while at the same time they lobby to keep trying to bring the basic broadband cost down. And then you have the other side of the market where the cost to transport the data is going up because of so something has to give somewhere.
Yeah.
Whether you say you add a Netflix delivery fee to the bill, you have to do better technology. There's something somewhere that's not
working. That's a fair point.
I'm very sympathetic.
And then this is the last thing. I agree with you. Consolidation. We should have more of it.
Yeah, and I think, I'm obviously not inviting companies to charge me more because nobody likes that. But looking at it dispassionately.
You get a lot for your money.
I mean, my son, who's just started using a phone, he's 12, and he's now on a basic tariff. But even with that, he gets enough to use the internet and some phone calls and it's £5 a month on.
Yeah, he's
on
probably
O2.
on Wi-Fi 90% of the time.
He's got a 4G connection on it. He can use data up to a certain point. He's on an O2.
But what I'm saying is most of his data consumption will be over your broadband.
It will be, but apparently most people's is anyway.
Yeah. But that comes back to my semi-drunken suggestion that we
meter everything.
We compel metering everything.
But I don't think metering. I think metering just sounds complicated, and it would make people unwilling to use services. I think a better thing is just to have higher charges.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're spending on your energy bill each month at the moment,
which is metered.
Right, that is metered, but there was a time I remember when I never used to really worry about it.
I'm shitting myself.
You never thought in winter, I'm not going to put the heating on.
I was almost £400 in December.
And it's a triple-digit fee. It's a high triple-digit fee. It might be going over 200 in
and
homes.
then what is the expectation for energy use for networks? But I think even if we never come to a point of some kind of regulated cost recovery, I think it's a very well point that you made, that we could reduce the regulation to let the companies be more profitable. Yeah. That they could be more efficient, because the whole issue that's kept Europe back is that they have not allowed the in-country consolidation. So they're insisting on 4 networks. That means you have to have 4 HR systems, 4 of everything. Yeah. When there's not economies of scale in that. You'd be better off with a 3, if not 2 operator market, and a lot of European
countries. I remember
countries.
Deutsche Telekom years ago trying to do this pan-European network idea, and I don't know where it's gone because they don't talk about it as much now. It's something I should probably pick up with them.
It's a non-starter because you can't harmonise the conditions across the country.
You can't harmonise the conditions, but this idea of having, it's obviously, you look at their networks and it's like a jigsaw across Central Europe, and yet each country has its own accounting function, its own, and it has to be done that way, probably for regulatory reasons.
Right, exactly.
And yet it's just very inefficient, and things. I mean, another thing I don't like is companies being charged loads of money for spectrum. I think it's outrageous. Yeah. I mean, it's never ever been as bad as it was in 3G. But you look at what Italy charged for, and actually one of the reasons Vodafone, its free cash flow was bad last time round in its half-yearly update was because of payments they're still making or were due to make because they make these in a staggered way, don't they? So you look at it and it's like, it's a couple of billion, but it actually turns up later.
Mm-hmm. To me, it's just absolutely transparent state cash grab.
They should have obligations. Mm-hmm. You have to do this, you have to do that, which some countries do. But this idea of charging companies billions to do it.
But why, if you weren't trying to maximise the revenue to the state, and I've had chats with Ofcom, because a few years ago they got butthurt because I was bitching about it so much. Yeah. And they're like, it costs quite a lot to regulate all this shit. I was like, okay, fair enough.
Yeah, okay.
Publish your accounts. And let's see what the gulf is between the revenue from just spectrum auctions. I don't know what other tax we take off them. Obviously, it's corporation tax. Just spectrum auctions and what it costs to run Ofcom. And the difference, let's all spend that on fucking fireworks on New Year's Eve or something like that. Because there's obviously a difference, and it's obviously just a form of tax. It's a form of government. And it's indirect tax because we all end up paying it.
Right. But it's such a great point that you make, because as a society, there's a lot of resources to go into regulation, which ends up being a subscription, which is so small. It's such a small part of your total consumer outlay, right? And we put so much energy into that, where you could say, well, gee, maybe it's better spent on something else, right? I mean, what are you, you talk about your son with a £5 subscription. So to me, this is the whole thing around the regulation has just become bigger than it needs to be. And it has, so what we're trying to solve it with more regulation on top, rather than saying, let's simplify.
And simplify is totally where I'm at.
But the £5 is quite, now this is why I'm sympathetic towards higher prices, because even paying 20 or 30, which I could probably go down to if I went SIM only, and I've got that option in a couple of months, it's like you have this device that shows you where you need to go, tells you what music to listen to each day, allows you to read news wherever you are. You can phone someone in an emergency. You can.
It's amazing.
It basically runs your life, and you're paying 20 quid for a month. Meanwhile, Scott's paying 400 quid on energy, and we're unsympathetic towards the idea that operators should be able to make a bit more. That is where I do have.
And even that 400 quid on energy is after the government's chucked me 60 quid because everyone's shitting themselves, so they're throwing some state money into the pot. I think. Just one thing before I forget, Roslyn, your point about the US market being competitive, I think it was broadband specifically you're referring to. I might be wrong, so I'm going to chuck this out here for you to correct me. So there's AT&T and there's Verizon and there's Comcast.
Well, so the interesting thing was, there's not great reporting about your U.S. market in Europe. This is not, I'm not impugning former, but you've got a higher percentage of cable.
How dare you?
You have a higher percentage of cable broadband. So first of all, you have two facilities
so we don't really
to every home.
understand cable in Europe.
Okay, but cable is legit. Okay, you can use it for your phone service. They have MVNOs.
It's dying.
No, but it's quite. Listen, cable is really real in the U.S.
Yeah,
I mean, so. And if you go to the Netherlands, you will understand the cable industry, because there's a flat country and every single residence has 2 lines to the home.
Or Germany has a lot, yeah?
Yes. Still. Well, I'm not sure, but I know Netherlands is almost a perfect example. So you have two lines to every, one cable, one telephone, one fiber line to every single home. Then you have mobile on top, and then you have satellite.
So what is cable as a technology? It's old school, isn't it?
It's DOCSIS 3. I mean, it's
copper.
Yeah,
it's coaxial.
Coaxial.
What does that mean? I mean, I should know what that means.
No, but what the actual materials are.
Right. But meaning, for home broadband, you can have cable, you can have fiber to the home, you can have fixed wireless.
There's a peak to the sort of bandwidth you're going to get on cable, because it is an old school technology.
It's they're gigabit speeds now. I mean,
the gigabit speeds are higher, but their upgrade
Okay.
path's not as good.
Yeah, but I mean, US, you have more than 100 million people having cable,
and they're getting good broadband.
Yes.
Okay.
But this is why companies like Altice in the US. Because they're 2 companies now, aren't they?
Yeah.
And Liberty Global in the UK, which is Virgin Media, are going away from cable.
Because the upgrade path.
So Virgin Media...
So it's not future-proof. It's all right for now, but it's not so good in 10 years' time.
His plan by the late 2020s is to be all fibre to the home.
Yeah.
And replace... Not go to DOCSIS 4.0.
Tall bloke with the hair.
But to go to the FTTP standards, because there's an argument that it's just more efficient, and in the long run it's better to go that way.
But in answer to my question about the main providers of fixed line telecoms.
So you've got fixed line telecoms. You have AT&T, Verizon. Dude, I'm putting me on the spot now.
No, don't worry, you don't have to list them all.
Yeah.
But the reason I brought it up was not to test your knowledge of every single provider, but to say that my understanding is there are a lot of parts of the States where not all of those are present.
Yes, you have a lot of regional providers. So, for example, there's actually 7...
Using Huawei equipment.
Yeah, we're not going there today. You'll see 7.
Hello.
So there's 7 5G networks in the United States. You have your AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile. Then you have Cell. I'm forgetting it.
But I'm talking about just fixed line.
Okay.
Just to let you know,
yeah.
The point I'm trying to get up to is, I think while there is nominal national competition, you could be in, I don't know, Kansas City, to pick a random place.
Where you get Google Fiber.
Okay, well, that's good. Maybe that's a shit example then. But you could be in Kansas City, just can't bother to think of other Punxsutawney. And you could be in some little backwater, yeah? Mm-hmm. And they could only be AT&T to that particular place. So then there's no competition for you as an individual.
This is the fault of regulation.
Right.
Because, first of all, the United States is a giant country. It's 340 million people. It's the world's third largest country, okay? Your mobile coverage is nationwide plus Alaska, Hawaii with 3 providers. You've got that.
Yeah.
And now you're going to 5G with that. So that is serviceable. Your fixed line with cable is always going to be constrained by the local franchise agreement. The cable is not a national service. It is they have to make an agreement with each municipality to cover that region. So that is a local level decision. So that is there. The other issue is the fixed line service. There's also it goes by the state. So the state sets up state of California does a contract with.
Us Europeans struggle to get our head around the state versus federal thing that you have in the state.
So that is still very real from traditional telecommunications. But I think when you go from the mobile perspective, I mean, listen, I would argue that there's true facilities-based competition because cable providers are doing Wi-Fi solutions. They have a connected car solution. They have for everything that 5G is trying to do, they're trying to do. Now, we can argue whether they succeed, but they legitimately try to compete. Okay. And so...
All right. So I think we're getting close to having to stop, aren't we, Pierre, in terms of hard cut-offs? I'm going to try and sort of summarise. In terms of the net neutrality thing, I think, and I'm saying this now because we've got time for you to correct me, Rosalind, I think we're saying that we're in favour of quite light touch net neutrality stuff. I think I am, but then I am about nearly everything. But I think you are too, and you're nodding. You're nodding for those listening. Sorry. What about you, Ian, when you finished coughing a lung up?
Yeah, I don't like the idea of tough sort of regulations in any area unless it's really sort of warranted. I mean, obviously you don't want monopolies. You want a regulator there to prevent that from happening. But these sort of willy-nilly
rules, not over-regulate.
I think net neutrality is over-regulated. I think it's a bit of a red herring. I mean, you see it come and go in the US.
Well, that's the other problem. Leaving aside how much it should be regulated, what the fuck is it in the first place? Yeah,
it's just so ill-defined. It's very
on
religious,
purpose.
And it's very.
On purpose,
I think it's all really, really silly.
Because there's lots of money in unresolved problems.
Yeah.
So that's that one. So there's a sort of broad unanimity within the room on that one, and then on the fair contribution. Supplier pays or whatever. I keep forgetting.
Sender pays.
Sender pays. God damn.
Which is not actually correct. And we didn't just get the point. It doesn't exist in South Korea. There's no sender pays policy.
I don't like that sender pays.
No,
really. Yeah.
People keep pushing back on that. The only reason I'm using sender pays is because I've just got a simple image, and I'm happy for you guys to be corrected. And we've got a couple of minutes left if you want to, of there being a pipe. One end of the pipe and the other end of the pipe. There's a sender end of the pipe and there's the consumer end of the pipe. Mm. Right now, the consumer pays. Yeah. I.e., the relationship with the people who run the pipe, they charge only the consumer. And the argument is that they should be able to charge the sender as well. And we got into
as well.
Yeah.
But they're not going to stop charging me, are they?
Oh, no.
If they want to charge Google and they get them to pay for my broadband service, I'm very happy for that.
But this is the other thing. Your son gets the $5, right? Because we still would say... maybe you can afford more, but there are 5 million people in the UK who can't, right? Yeah. And then the other part, there are additional services you might like. There's sponsored data. Maybe there's specialized service. There's businesses or others, right? And by the way, I still have a thing of I don't want to pay for Netflix if I'm not watching it, right?
Which is a decent argument.
Yeah. Yep. And I don't want to pay for the provisioning of it either.
But that comes back to my mandated metering thing.
Yeah.
But there we go. So I don't think we have such clear sort of unanimity on the fair contribution thing.
But it's still evolving anyway. The debate is not yet.
Do you think if you were forced, like at this Ofcom thing you were at yesterday, if you were forced to a yes or no answer,
I would definitely say yes. So here, my first best is get rid of net neutrality and let the parties sort it out.
Yeah,
that would be they will duke it out. what Ofcom's concerned about is they're going to bring it to Ofcom's door, and then Ofcom will not be able to do everything because everyone's going to complain. I would like to go back to a free market where the content providers and the ISPs actually have to sort it out themselves.
Are you optimistic that Ofcom will do something?
No, I think because Ofcom can't. By law, UK government has to make the change.
But for them to try,
they can advise. They
seem
got a strong
to be quite
advisory
keen
capacity.
to set themselves apart from the EU in some ways and justify Brexit by doing things like this and saying, oh look, we've got a really innovative internet sector now. So it's an opportunity for them to go, well, we're not going to have net neutrality regulation.
They correctly point out that it's still, from their perspective, the ability to make a decision is nascent because there's not yet enough information to inform their decision.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're trying to get more information. I think that's a fair place for them to be.
It's totally honest.
Yes.
And well, I mean, I think I'll probably wrap it up there because we're nearly out of time, and you got a plane to catch. And Pierre's got kids to pick up from school, or whatever it is he's got to do.
And you got a pub to visit.
And me and Ian have got a pub to befoul. Shit, I've forgotten after all that dicking
We didn't
about.
even talk about Cellnex.
What was I just going to say? I was just going to wrap it up. I think just in the regulation thing on the whole, let things run their course where you possibly can, but also totally acknowledge that regulation's valid, and not just valid, but vital. And
you have tools to come in when you need to.
Yeah.
It's not like there's all kinds of stuff in the background that's there that they can use, and that they have tools at their disposal. They can use those tools.
And people need to look at, whenever something comes through, and this is something that interests me. I told you I've been writing up these Twitter files. I'm certainly not going to get into that now because we've got almost no time left. But there are all these powers, there are all these interests at work. And I think people can sometimes be very naive about how the world works. Of course, it's all about power and interests and trying to impose your will and trying to make money and and that's fine. I mean, it's not nice. I'm not happy about it. If my kids were younger and I had my daughter balanced on my knee, I wouldn't be telling her about the world's just full of sort of mercenary bastards. But once you're a grown-up, that is how the world works. We all want to do better for ourselves. We all want our team to win. And you need to interpret. Most of the things that happen don't happen organically or spontaneously. They happen because there are people behind the scenes, probably normally quite well-paid, well-educated people, well-qualified people, who are trying to make it happen. And there's a tension between loads of them all over the place. And part of the job of journalists or academics or commentators or just people who gobshites is to call that out rather than just go along with it. And this is something that appalls me about a lot of modern commentariat, is they all seem to be captured by some interest group or another. And I can understand who am I to say? If someone went to me, Scott, whatever you're paying, I'll double it if you only ever advocate in favour of this particular thing, I'd fucking think about it. I'd like to say that I wouldn't do it. And I'd be like, no, I'm above such things. But someone's suddenly chucking a bunch of wedge at me, and I'm thinking about fucking Maldives next year. Who's to say? Anyway, so that's that. Rosalind, incredibly grateful for having you here. I'm so pleased. Sorry, John, that she beat you to it. But John, we'll get you
Ladies
on one
first.
of these days. Yeah, we'll get you on one of these days. And I think you really helped shed a lot of light on this stuff. We didn't get onto the third topic, but I think that's good because these are
so great to be with
exploring.
you. Can I just put a plug of you can sign up for our free newsletter at Strand Consult.
Sure,
and
go
we
for
have
it. Do the plug.
we've got research notes and reports on all these topics.
Yeah. Do you know, I've realised podcasts I listen to, normally they have better manners than I do, and they go, how can people get hold of you? And they encourage you to say your sort of Twitter handle and all that sort of thing. But yes, Strand Consult, of which Rosalind is a key part. You can. I get your newsletter. I've got to admit, before this, you and your business partner John were sending all these exhaustive reports that you're writing. I didn't get around to reading.
That's
I
so
skimmed
totally
them.
Listen, you got the summary in person, so
yeah,
I came here to do that.
I mean, that's part of my excuse for my laziness. It's better to hear it from.
But the other
directly.
part is our sort of brand is we document everything we say. We're very fact-based, evidence-based, and you can please, if you see a flaw in our methodology, please bring it to our attention.
Exactly. It's all about honesty and transparency and truth. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.